Good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, wherever you are. Hello, my name is John from Compliance Gate, and in this video I'll introduce you to an article topic that was published back in July on voluntary product safety standards. In this video, this video is just a short summary of the article. And the article tackled a number of questions that we get often, especially in relation to voluntary safety standards. And we're talking about both questions, for people that are interested in the EU markets, the UK market, or even in the US markets. So here are the following questions that the article addresses, and I'll be summarizing in this video. So the first set of questions: what are voluntary product safety standards? What are mandatory product safety standards? And what's the difference between the two? The second one being, what are some of the benefits of ensuring compliance with voluntary safety standards? I mean, is it just a sunk cost, or what's the point of voluntarily spending money, time, and effort to meet voluntary safety standards for your own product? A third common question also that I'll be addressing is, are harmonized standards voluntary in the EU? Especially for those importers and manufacturers that are interested in introducing their product in the EU market. Another interesting question that we've been getting recently is whether, especially in relation to the benefits of meeting voluntary safety standards, whether complying with said voluntary product safety standards, whether they can be used as a defense against product liability claims. Lastly, are there any advantages to exceeding voluntary safety standards? So we're not talking about mandatory safety standards in which, whether you like it or not, if you have to comply with, especially if you're talking about a regulated product area and you're looking at the regulation and they tell you have to comply with it. And then we're not also talking about just voluntary safety standards out there written by organizations or sold by organizations like ASTM and the sort. But we're talking, the last question deals with exceeding, whether there are any advantages to going beyond what's already set, So, to start off with the first set of questions: what are voluntary and mandatory product standards? What's the difference? Well, the difference, put simply, is mandatory product safety standards are standards in which importers and manufacturers, in order to have their product entered into a particular market, be it the EU, UK, or the US, they have to comply with certain things, with certain standards that are mentioned in the legislation. And usually the legislation or the regulation would make it very clear that a particular standard needs to be met. Usually they would use words like shall, must. They won't use words like may or any other word that indicates that it's an option, to meet certain standards that would otherwise be voluntary. A lot of these standards tend to be voluntary. Now, a standard, voluntary product safety standards are standards that, it's up to you. There's no legislation, regulation, or code compelling you to meet these standards. Now, the question comes, why would an importer and manufacturer spend the time, money, and effort to meet voluntary safety standards, especially when they're trying to when they're trying to introduce their own new product into a particular jurisdiction, or even on an online platform like Amazon? Why would you do that? Why would you spend the extra time and money? Well, here are some of the benefits, and it's also covered in the article. So some of the benefits of meeting voluntary safety standards include building consumer confidence, enabling importers and manufacturers to gain access to markets. I'm not just talking about the EU and the US and these type of jurisdictions, but also I'm talking about online platforms like Amazon. Increasingly, you'll notice that online platforms like Amazon and eBay, you'll notice that they actually require, and they'll make it very clear that they require certain safety standards to be met. Some other benefits includes providing a competitive advantage. You know, adopting certain voluntary standards, let's put it this way, it gives you certain bragging rights. You know, you get to make certain claims about your product, you know, that your product meets certain industry standards, or it's the state of the art when it comes to product safety. And that helps because, especially, it depends on the type of market that you're aiming for. And lastly, meeting voluntary product safety standards helps provide for a certain degree of protection from product liability claims. Later, I will get back to this, so you can look forward to that. Now, the next section in the article it was a really short one. It dealt with a question that we receive quite often, you know, whether harmonized standards are voluntary in the EU. The short answer, the answer is yes, they are voluntary unless the legislation says that they're not. Again, a key difference between voluntary and mandatory standards is it's whether the legislation or the regulation or the code instrument compels you. It's using these words that indicate that you're compelled to take these standards, you know, and they'll use words like must and shall. Okay, so recall earlier that I was talking about the benefits of adopting voluntary product safety standards, and I mentioned that from a legal standpoint of view, that it can help, especially when it comes to product liability claims. Now, the question that we have over here is, can meeting such voluntary product safety standards be used as a defense against product liability claims? The short answer is yes, but how you go about doing it, or the legal significance, you know, of this answer depends on the jurisdiction. Now, my background is in law, and in common law in particular. And in common law, we're aware that we have, in common law jurisdictions like the US, UK, India, Australia, and the sorts, even Hong Kong, we know that there are two sources of law. You have codified law. We're talking about statutes, ordinances, regulations, and the sort. And we have law that comes from cases, or so-called case law. Now, in the US, for example, product liability claims can get tricky, just because you can have an importer or a manufacturer that did everything right. They submitted all the documents that were required, you know, they purchased all the standards from ASTM and all, you know, standard developing bodies, and they followed it to the teeth. And yet they were still slapped with a product liability claim. And if you read a lot of these cases, or if you have a friend that happens to be a lawyer, you can ask them about manufacturer liability cases. You'll understand that there's this whole body of law in which requires manufacturers and importers to go beyond, or to provide a reasonable design for the intended user. So in the US, for example, you have three kinds of defects that it's recognized in case law: manufacturing defects, defects in relation to warnings and instructions, and design defects. And if you look at design defects, these are products that are designed in a manner that carries a foreseeable risk of harm to the user, and that such a risk could have been mitigated or avoided by using a reasonable alternative design. Now, you can make the argument that, hey, I followed the standard that was required of me, by a certain regulation or a statute. But then what you would find is that you'd find plaintiffs talking about whether that was enough to mitigate the risk that was foreseeable. Basically, a lot of these cases, you'll notice, go beyond, and you get this impression that a lot of these regulations, from the court's point of view, these are minimum requirements. So, in summary, there are times, in summary, there are times in which you'd want to, depending on the jurisdiction, you would want to meet certain voluntary product safety standards, or you would want to go beyond voluntary product safety standards, just so that you could provide that line of argument that, hey, I provided, I employed for my own product the best risk assessment measure that was out there. Now, that's all the time I have right now. But if you're more interested in this, and we do have a lot of articles that are associated with voluntary product safety standards and mandatory product safety standards. But if you're interested in the specifics, you can read my article, or you can read some of the articles that are associated with it. Another interesting note, the consumer product, especially for those that are interested in the U.S. market, the Consumer Protection Safety Commission published a really neat article that really touches upon this, about meeting voluntary product safety standards, about, and also when it comes to exceeding them sometimes. And that article is linked in the final section. If you view my article, if you scroll all the way down, I do have a link, a certain phrase that I link called Best Practices article by the Consumer Product Protection Safety Commission, which you can click if you're interested, especially if you're interested in the U.S. market. Okay.